Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday to you all out there. If you're watching when this comes out, it is Sunday here, and also 6 in the evening. So, it's we're about to start the work week, and Monday is my day of grading. So, which is cool. I love the work week just as much as the weekend. There's lots of noise outside. Hopefully that won't be too much of a bother. All right, so we're gonna go back to reading through Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, and we finished with the preface. Now we are in a section called Tuning Up, and almost finished with that, so we'll probably get finished with that today and move on. And I stopped right before the first little lyric prose poem. So last time we left off with, I believe, sort of this narration kind of in the third person from Johannes de Silencio. I think that's who's speaking. The narrator, at any rate, is talking about how, he's trying to navigate through the story of Abraham and Isaac, and he's imagining all of the various possibilities of what is psychologically going through Abraham's mind and what he's doing as a result. And so, so they're taking this 3-day journey out to the place where, Abraham has promised to or agreed to sacrifice his son, but, is sort of believing for God to save him. But he's going through this feeling of panic. And so he says to Isaac, his son, "Foolish boy, do you believe that I'm your father? I'm an idolater. Do you believe this is God's command? No, it's my desire." So in a way, he's having this crisis. He's having a loss of faith. So even though he's going to go through with it if he really needs to, he would be, in Kierkegaard's mind, misreading it to make it more palatable, relatable. The father is... it shows that the father is not just a sort of manic zealot, but he doesn't really want to do this. He's in such distress, and he really wants to, for some reason, he thinks telling Isaac this and taking the blame for it will solve something. And then we have this poem, this prose poem. And it says, "When the child is to be weaned, the mother blackens her breast, for it would indeed be a shame for the breast to look delightful when the child must not have it. So the child believes that the breast is changed, but the mother is the same. Her gaze is loving and tender as always. Fortunate the one who did not need more frightful measures to wean the child." So to me, the confusing part is why this particular prose poem comes after the first misreading, that particular misreading. But I feel that the message of the prose poem is a little more clear to me. It seems to be saying that, it seems to be maybe referring to the idea that even something that's kind of painful, a change that's painful, or, because it's the child has to move on to solid food, it's for your own good, right? And so you can still, and so it says, "Fortunate the one who did not need more frightful measures to wean the child." So it's just a little kind of push, to start growing up. But maybe some of you can make the connection why it comes where it does. And there's 4 of these, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so then sort of there's another reading of the Abraham and Isaac story. So let's see what this one says. It was an early morning. Abraham rose early. He embraced Sarah, the bride of his old age, and Sarah kissed Isaac, who took away her disgrace, who was her pride, her hope for all generations. Then they rode silently along the way, and Abraham's eyes were fastened upon the ground until the fourth day, when he lifted up his eyes and saw Mount Moriah far away. But his eyes turned again towards the ground. Silently he arranged the firewood and bound Isaac. Silently he drew the knife. Then he saw the ram that God had chosen. He sacrificed it and went home. From that day on, Abraham became old. He could not forget that God had demanded this of him. Isaac flourished as before, but Abraham's eyes were darkened. He saw joy no more. So, so this reading says that, okay, so then he saw the ram that God had chosen. So is it assumed then with this reading that, the message from God has clear that, no, it was just a test. You don't need to sacrifice. So I think there's maybe some disappointment then disappointment on Abraham's part that he did not go through with what he thought was going to be like a great sacrifice. So not just a test of his faith, but an actual sacrifice that he's going through. It's kind of, he can't be the martyr. He is kind of relegated back to the mundane. And so this is maybe another reading or misreading, because Abraham basically lost his joy. And that's not really what Kierkegaard is wanting for us. So it's another sort of path that we should not take, and not, if Abraham's supposed to be our model, then we can't try to superimpose that kind of revision on the story. So then you have another prose poem, and it says, when the child has grown larger and is to be weaned, the mother covers her breast in a maidenly manner. So the child no longer has a mother. Fortunate the child who did not lose its mother in some other way. So that's interesting. So in the first prose poem, the child, just has a little bit of, the child is made to not want what he's not supposed to want any longer. So it's kind of doing it for the good of the child, but still it said, remember, the mother is the same, her gaze is loving and tender as always. But in this one, the child no longer has a mother, I guess because there's this distancing. So there's no longer a view of the mother's body, but she covers it. And so there's kind of this separation, or this imposition of, I guess, propriety that is probably at this stage not necessary, but maybe it has to do more with culture, etc. So the sacrifice is actually greater and unnecessary, so the child no longer has a mother. But again, the connection to the misreading, I don't know. So I can read the poems, I just don't know the connection, like why it comes when it comes, I guess. Okay, so here's the other story. It was an early morning, so we're reading it again. Abraham rose early. He kissed Sarah, the young mother, and Sarah kissed Isaac, her delight, her joy at all times. And Abraham rode pensively along the way. He thought of Hagar and the son whom he turned out into the desert. He climbed Mount Moriah. He drew the knife. So that's interesting. Why is he thinking about his other son? It was a quiet evening when Abraham rode out alone, and he rode to Mount Moriah. He threw himself upon his face. He begged God to forgive his sin, that he had been willing to sacrifice Isaac, that the father had forgotten his duty toward his son. More than once he rode his lonely trail, but found no peace of mind. He could not comprehend that it was a sin to have been willing to sacrifice to God the best he owned, that for which he himself would gladly have laid down his life many times. And if it were a sin, if he had not loved Isaac in this way, then he could not understand how it could be forgiven. For what sin was more grievous? So it says that he rode out alone. Okay, but he climbed Mount Moriah, he drew the knife. Okay, so I guess in this one he goes through with it, but he's still in he rode out alone, so he rode to Mount Moriah. So what is actually happening here? He's writing pensively, because there's no mention of Isaac after Sarah kissing him. He begged God to forgive his son, that he had been willing to sacrifice Isaac. So I guess he's just feeling guilty. He's still stuck in the ethical or the moral, instead of having faith, like taking a leap of faith and being sort of passionate and joyful in that. Because it ends with, for what sin was more grievous? So again, I think the grief or the distress is directed in sort of the wrong way, or on the wrong thing or the aspect of the situation. So the prose poem is, when the child is to be weaned, the mother too is not without sorrow. That she and the child are more and more to be parted, that the child who first lay beneath her heart, yet later reposed upon her breast, will not be so close any more. Thus together they mourn this brief sorrow. Fortunate the one who kept the child so close and did not need to sorrow more. So here I feel it's kind of like the mother is having sort of this, maybe it's natural. I mean, I don't want to maybe jump to the conclusion that it's an like over attachment to the child, but in a way, I think Kierkegaard would, say that this is also kind of love or connection or attachment misplaced, because maybe it should be a happy, joyful time that your child is growing up, that your child doesn't, is moving on again to the solid food. That's what this situation is about. And it's just a natural progression. So maybe he is kind of uncovering and making commentary on the malaise of what emotionally holds individuals in his culture back from moving in the direction that he wants. I'm sure there's some really great commentary on this that makes this all clear, but I kind of like to struggle. And again, I've read this before, but I just enjoy struggling through a text. All right, so let's continue to do that. And this is the last one. It was an early morning. Everything was ready for the journey in Abraham's house. He took leave of Sarah, and the faithful servant Eliezer saw him out along the road until he turned back again. They rode together in harmony, Abraham and Isaac, until they came to Mount Moriah. Yet Abraham calmly and gently prepared everything for the sacrifice, but as he turned away and drew the knife, Isaac saw that Abraham's left hand was clenched in despair, that a shudder went through his body, but Abraham drew the knife. Then they returned home again, and Sarah hurried to meet them, but Isaac had lost the faith. Never a word is spoken about this in the world. Isaac never spoke to any person about what he had seen, and Abraham did not suspect that anyone had seen it. When the child is to be weaned, so here is the poem. When the child is to be weaned, the mother has more solid food on hand so the child will not perish. Fortunate the one who has this stronger nourishment handy. Okay, so that sounds really positive. So does that mean that then this last interpretation was a more solid, acceptable interpretation? Because it still sounds like there's problematic elements to me. One that, so Abraham's left hand was clenched in despair, that a shudder went through his body. And then as a result, Isaac had lost the faith. Did he lose the faith because Abraham doubted? But it says, but Abraham drew the knife. But doesn't he always draw the knife? So, and there's this kind of like this uncomfortable secret, but yet the lyric poem, if the lyric poem is supposed to be another way to discuss what's going on in the previous reading of this story, it seems like Abraham is read in a way that he can be a model to us. So I don't know. And then it ends with, in these and many similar ways, that man of whom we speak pondered over this event. Okay, so it's kind of like so it's about Johannes de Silencio, his readings, but in a third person point of view. Every time he returned home from a pilgrimage to Mount Moriah, he collapsed from fatigue, clasped his hands, and said, "Surely no one was as great as Abraham. Who is able to understand him?" This is really... So it would be really interesting to hear how, people usually see the relationship between these four readings and use maybe the prose poems to sort of unlock the riddle or the clue. I'm not sure, if I, did anything to clarify this passage. But, sometimes I think when you're reading something in philosophy for just maybe the second time, I think it does take a couple of readings and maybe looking at other, then that's the time, I guess, to look at other commentaries and interpretations. But I think that, even my advice to college students who are reading texts in philosophy and maybe intro to philosophy, it is just as helpful to locate parts of the text that are confusing for you and that remain confusing, because those are kind of the sweet spots, I think, of the text, where you can return to it and keep thinking about it, and then we will eventually get it, right? So, so that's that. All right, so I'm going to move to a tribute to Abraham. It's the next section. And let's see what it says, because I don't remember. If there were no eternal consciousness in a human being, if underlying everything were only a wild, fermenting force writhing in dark passions that produced everything great and insignificant, if a bottomless, insatiable emptiness lurked beneath everything, what would life be but then despair? If such were the case, if there were no sacred bond that tied humankind together, if one generation after another rose like leaves in the forest, if one generation succeeded another like the singing of birds in the forest, if the human race passed through the world as a ship through the sea, as the wind through the desert, a thoughtless and futile activity, if an eternal oblivion always hungrily lay in wait for its prey, and there were no power strong enough to snatch it away, then how empty and hopeless life would be. But that is why it is not so. And as God created man and woman, so he fashioned the hero and the poet or orator. The latter can do nothing that the former does. He can only admire, love, and rejoice in the hero, yet he too is happy, no less than the former. For the hero is so to speak his better nature, with which he is infatuated. For the hero is so to speak his better nature, with which he is infatuated, yet delighted that it is after all not himself, that his love can be admiration. I guess not everyone can be the hero. He is the guardian spirit of recollection. He can do nothing without remembering what has been done. Do nothing without admiring what has been done. He takes nothing for himself, but is protective of what is entrusted to him. He follows his heart's desire, but when he has found what was sought, he wanders about to every man's door with his song and his speech, so that everyone may admire the hero as he does. So it's kind of like there's the person who does the action, and then the people who admire and are inspired by the hero. Be proud of the hero as he is. This is his achievement, his humble task, his faithful service in the house of the hero. If he remains true to his love in this way, and I just want to remind us that this section is called A Tribute to Abraham. If he struggles day and night with the cunning of oblivion, which wants to trick him out of the hero, then he has fulfilled his task. He is united with the hero, who has loved him just as faithfully. For the poet is, so to speak, the hero's better nature, feeble like a memory, to be sure, but also glorified like a memory. Therefore, no one who is great will be forgotten, and even if it takes a long time, even if a cloud of misunderstanding whisks the hero away, his lover still comes, and the more time goes by, the more steadfastly he clings to them. Okay, so that's interesting. It just seems like the world needs both. And the beginning, if there were no eternal consciousness, so it talks about, and then it says, but this is why it's not so. So there apparently is eternal consciousness, and there is a meaning behind the world, a significance to the world, and there is a sacred bond that ties humankind together. So, again, I think it maybe harkens back to Kierkegaard's desire for depth in, sorry, there's like knocking. It's the worst living in an apartment, I have to say. for depth and for meaning and for real desire and real passion and real action. He just, I think, disdains the particular priorities of the culture, which again, I think that we can relate to maybe if we have any criticisms of our own culture. I think about, for me, what's important and what I think, inspiring priorities would be for the world. I think it would be based on knowledge and meaningful intellectual conversations and talking about books and reading books and going out in nature and dwelling and, kind of along with Heidegger, what he says, not making everything into a commodity or standing reserve, but dwelling and letting truth constantly be revealed. Viewing art and creating art and communing with each other and, all these things that I think sometimes get shelved or ignored because we're all in this rat race to burn ourselves out through continual productivity to get to, I don't know, I guess a comfortable place where we have all our basic needs and can enjoy life. So, yeah. Okay, so moving on. No one who was great in the world will be forgotten, but each was great in his own way, and each in proportion to the greatness of what he loved. For the one who loved himself became great by himself, and the one who loved other persons became great by his devotion. But the one who loved God became greater than everybody. Each will be remembered, but each became great in proportion to his expectation. So I think that probably relates back to faith, believing in something, expecting a lot. One became great by expecting the possible, another by expecting the eternal, but the one who expected the impossible became greater than everybody. So, what do we need to truly progress? What do we need to break beyond the surface? Each will be remembered, but each was great wholly in proportion to the magnitude of that with which he struggled. For the one who struggled with the world became great by conquering the world, and the one who struggled with himself became greater by conquering himself. Oh, that's interesting. That little hierarchy there. But the one who struggled with God became greater than everybody. Thus there was conflict in the world, man against man, 1 against 1,000. But the one who struggled with God was greater than everybody. So I guess my question would be, what does it mean to struggle with God? Thus there was conflict. That's right. It's just repeating. Thus there was a conflict on the earth. There was the one who conquered all by his power, and the one who conquered God by his powerlessness. That's really interesting. So it's, I don't know, that almost sounds like a negative theology in a sense. Like your weakness, your acceptance of your lack helps you transcend more to God, to sort of like a mystical unity. There was the one who relied on himself and gained everything, and the one who, secure in his own strength, sacrificed everything. But the one who believed in God was greater than everybody. There was the one who was great by his power, and the one who was great by his wisdom, and the one who was great by his hope, and the one who was great by his love. But Abraham was greater than everybody, great by that power whose strength is powerlessness, great by that wisdom whose secret is folly, great by that hope whose form is madness, great by that love, which is hatred of oneself. So it's kind of like being in this paradoxical state, which Heidegger also talks about. And I only bring up Heidegger because I'm doing an independent study of Heidegger because I just can't stop reading him. So, when Heidegger always says, he doesn't want us to be in sort of passivity, because that would be more like conforming and going with the flow of the they and the world and the thrownness, but also to really create space for truth to be disclosed. It's an allowing of truth to be. It's allowing being to be. It's allowing presence to presence, So there's also this kind of letting go of control and letting go maybe of the ego. And there's lots of paradoxes in the Christian scriptures, right? So like John 12:25, anyone who loves their life will lose it. Anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. It's the idea of let him become a fool so he can become wise. Let him become a fool in the ways of the world so he can become wise in those things of God. So that's interesting, this look at sort of negative aspects or lack or absence for kind of like annihilation of self, or unity of God with God. So it says, by faith, Abraham emigrated from the land of his fathers and became a foreigner in the promised land. He left one thing behind and took one thing with him. He left his worldly understanding behind and took faith with him. Otherwise, he undoubtedly would not have emigrated, but surely would have thought it preposterous. So what is rational by the world's terms isn't always the ultimate reason, I guess, or the ultimate manifestation or example or essence of reason. By faith he was a stranger in the promised land, and there was nothing that reminded him of what was dear to him, but his soul was tempted to wistful nostalgia by the novelty of everything. Oh, that's a really interesting phrase. And yet he was God's chosen one, in whom the Lord was well pleased. In fact, he had been a castaway, banished from God's grace. Had he been a castaway, banished from God's grace, he could have understood it better, but now it certainly seemed like a mockery of him and his faith. There was also in the world one who lived, I think that's really interesting. I wish I had something to say about that. Why he that even in the temptation of his soul, like giving in maybe a little bit or wanting to give in to the temptation of his soul to wistful nostalgia, he's nevertheless in his, imperfection, the chosen one. And so I guess it seems like a mockery of him and his faith. Like it might too, if Abraham was a perfectionist and he's almost criticizing God for, not having higher standards, I guess. There was also in the world one who lived in exile from the ancestral land which he loved. He has not forgotten nor his songs of lamentation, when in sadness he sought and found what was lost. From Abraham there is no song of lament. It is human to lament, human to weep with the one who weeps, but it is greater to believe, more blessed to behold the believer. That's interesting. It seems really stoic. And, going back to the various and the four interpretations of Abraham, I was thinking, well, what reading would I want to superimpose upon Abraham to make Abraham into someone I could admire? And this is probably just because I'm a modern reader and not actually maybe doing good like Hebrew scripture exegesis, which I probably need to read and see if there's anything that can help understand at least what the traditional Jewish reading of Abraham and Isaac is. I'm more familiar of how it would be discussed in like Christian circles. But that said, my chosen interpretation would be, or how I would want to, my midrash on the story, would be for Abraham to hear this request of God and to laugh, to have so much faith in God that Abraham doesn't even go on the journey or goes on the journey with Isaac in a comical fashion, almost as he was like playfully parodying, like, oh, kind of thinking like, oh, like, I know you're teasing me. You have to be teasing me. You wouldn't actually ask me to do this. So I'm not even going to, and they make a joke of it because he gets the ending. He doesn't have to play it out in seriousness. But all of these, none of those 4 readings really were that reading, right? Abraham was in distress and he took it seriously. But it seems to me that it would be more admirable to, know God so well, imagining God is like a healthy, good kind of being, that it's just ridiculous. Which I think would be also a healthy model for people who might try to take scriptures literally and say, well, if God wants me to do it and thinks I should do it, then I'm going to take a leap of faith and, who cares about the ethics of the world? This is what's ethical for me. That's problematic, right? So that, I just wanted to share, I guess. So, let's see. By faith, Abraham received the promise that in his seed, all the generations of the world would be blessed. Time passed, the possibility was there. Abraham believed. Time passed, it became preposterous. Abraham believed. There was one in the world who also had an expectation. Time passed. Evening drew near. He was not wretched enough to have forgotten his expectation. Therefore, neither will he be forgotten. Then he sorrowed, and the sorrow did not cheat him as life had done. It did everything it could for him. In the sweetness of sorrow, he possessed his disappointed expectation. It is human to sorrow. It is human to sorrow with the sorrowing one. But it is greater to believe, more blessed to behold the believer. So I don't know, is Kierkegaard wanting us to be just really steadfast and not wanting us to have any emotions? From Abraham we have no song of sorrow. He did not mournfully count the days while time passed. He did not look at Sarah with suspicious eyes as to whether she had not become old. He did not halt the movement of the sun so that Sarah would not grow old, and with her his expectation he did not soothingly sing for Sarah his mournful melody. Abraham became old, Sarah became the object of ridicule in the land, and yet he was God's chosen one and heir to the promise that in his seed all the generations of the earth would be blessed. So would it have not been better after all if he were not God's chosen one? What does it mean to be God's chosen one? Is it to be denied one's youthful wish in youth so that it may be fulfilled with great pains in old age? So that's an interesting question. Like, by I guess typical sort of human standards, what good is it to be a chosen one if, you have to sort of wait and have so much patience, I guess. And it's almost like your faith is tested to see if you doubt or if you keep your faith. Is that really a position people want? But Abraham believed and held on to the promise. If Abraham wavered, he would have given it up. He would have said to God, well, perhaps it is not your will after all that it should happen, so I will give up the wish. It was only my wish, my blessedness. My soul is sincere. I harbor no hidden resentment because you denied it. So again, this is kind of, the tendency, an example of the tendency to just justify. Like, you believe God for something and you have faith and then it doesn't happen. You try to just cover over it and you're like, oh, well, maybe I just thought that was a promise, or I thought I should have faith on this, but it just wasn't meant to be. So we'll move on. He would not have been forgotten. He would have saved many by his example, but still would not have become the father of faith. For it is great to give up one's wish, but it is greater to keep a firm grip, there we go, on it after having given it up. It is great to hold of the eternal, but it is greater to stick doggedly to the temporal after having given it up. Then came the fullness of time. If Abraham had not believed, Sarah might well have died from sorrow, and Abraham, dulled by grief, would not have understood the fulfillment, but only smiled at it as a youthful dream. But Abraham believed, therefore he was young, for the one who always hopes for the best grows old, cheated by life, and the one who is always prepared for the worst grows old prematurely. But the one who believes preserves an eternal youth. So I wonder if it's maybe like the middle way or a third alternative, because if you have too high of hopes, if you have too high of expectations, you're going to be disappointed. But if you are too pessimistic, that's just self-defeating in itself. But then there's this third alternative of believing. So let us pay tribute to that story. For Sarah, though aged, was young enough to crave the pleasure of motherhood, and Abraham, though gray-haired, was young enough to wish to be a father. Outwardly, the wonder is that it happened in accordance with their expectation. In a deeper sense, the wonder of faith consists in Abraham and Sarah being young enough to wish, and in faith's having preserved their wish, and with it their youth. He accepted the fulfillment of the promise. He accepted it in faith. Sorry, I just want to see. Yeah, I don't think we can finish this. It's not too much longer, but still, it's like 4 more pages. 4 or 5 more pages. All right, we'll read a little bit more. I don't know if there's really a natural stopping place, but okay. And it happened according to the promise and according to faith, for Moses struck the rock with his staff, but he did not believe. Really? He didn't? I have to go back and read that story. So there was rejoicing in Abraham's house when Sarah stood as a bride on their golden wedding anniversary. But it was not to remain that way. Abraham was to be tried once more. He had fought with that ingenious power which invents everything, with that vigilant enemy which never dozes, with that old man who outlives everything. He had fought with time and kept the faith. Now all the frightfulness of the struggle became concentrated in one moment. Quote, and God tested Abraham and said to him, take Isaac, your only son, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering upon a mountain that I will show you. Thus everything was lost, which is even more frightful than if it had never happened. It's like, so your greatest desire comes and then it's immediately taken away. I mean, it sounds a bit like you're in a sort of relationship with a sadist in a sense, but Kierkegaard has a more positive reading of that. But but not yet. So the Lord was only mocking Abraham, is perhaps what, people might say. Wrongly, though. Miraculously, he made the preposterous come true. Now he would see it brought to nothing again. It was indeed folly, but Abraham did not laugh at it, as Sarah had done when the promise was first proclaimed. It's always the women, right? The women are laughing, or looking back and turning into salt. Everything was lost. 70 years of faithful expectation, the brief joy over faith's fulfillment. Who is it, then, that snatches the staff from the old man? Who is it that demands he himself must break it? Who is it that makes a man's gray hairs disconsolate? Disconsolate? Okay. Who is it that demands he himself must do it? Is there no compassion for this venerable old man, none for the innocent child? And yet, so I think Kierkegaard is kind of pointing out the various sort of mundane protestations that we might have at this story, but Kierkegaard is saying, no, Abraham was, is a model because he, and also, the reader who's reading this correctly is not being swept away or, what was the word I was going to say? It started with an S. I don't know. He's not, they're not lowering themselves or succumbing to, that's the word, succumbing to the, kind of the more base, mundane reactions. This is a story that is, of faith. And yet Abraham was God's chosen one, and it was the Lord who put him to the test. Now everything would be lost. The glorious remembrance of posterity. The promise in Abraham's seed was only a whim, a passing thought of the Lord's, which Abraham now must obliterate. That glorious treasure, which was just as old as the faith in Abraham's heart and many, many years older than Isaac, the fruit of Abraham's life, dedicated by prayer, ripened by combat, the blessing on Abraham's lips, this fruit would now be plucked prematurely and be without meaning. For what meaning would it have if Isaac must be sacrificed? That sad but still blessed hour when Abraham would take leave of everything that was dear to him, when he would once again lift up his venerable head, when his countenance would become radiant like the Lord's, when he would concentrate his whole soul in a blessing that was mighty enough to make Abraham blessed all his days, that hour would not come. So he's kind of, taking on the voice, the narrator's kind of taking on the voice of those sort of profane protestations. For Abraham would indeed take leave of Isaac, but in such a way that he himself would remain behind. Death would separate them, but in such a way that Isaac would become its prey. The old man would not joyfully at death lay his hand upon Isaac in blessing, but weary of life would lay a violent hand upon Isaac. And it was God who tested him. Yes, woe to the messenger who brought such news to Abraham. Who would have dared to be the emissary of such great sorrow? But it was God who tested Abraham. But Abraham believed and believed for this life. So, Abraham is not like those of us who would have our, wallow in our profane protestations of this story. This story is to be preserved, and it is important. It's really interesting. I was listening to a discussion about this, and there was the question, I guess what is left for the reader of this as a philosophical text, which is so, I guess, weighed down, especially in this A Tribute to Abraham, this section, just theological and almost, it's like you have to kind of find the philosophy in it. Like, what is the philosophical treatment? It's different than just a purely theological kind of explanation or exegesis or, discussion of this text. We're in the realm of philosophy. So, does then Kierkegaard, I think is the question, why does he use it? And does he offer, I don't think it's really Kierkegaard's, even though he's going through various readings, I'm not sure that he offers a different reading than like maybe a traditional, at least Christian reading of Abraham. Because the Christian reading of Abraham is that Abraham was a man of faith, and he would do, and that was, that's kind of just the general gist of it. And that's kind of what Kierkegaard is saying as a model, but not just for religious people. So maybe he's using it in a different way, but the reading doesn't necessarily change. So I think that really the reader of this text has to accept that, like grapple with it. Because I think usually when we're taking scriptures and we are kind of looking at them academically, the modern person might accept that there's going to be a new aspect of the reading that is brought to life for theology, so we can read it more like in an empowering way, a liberating way. We're arguing for a particular interpretation. But Kierkegaard, I don't think, is doing that. He's accepting really what the traditional reading is and using it not to change like a religious person's understanding of it, but the reader of philosophy will gain something that's, maybe secular for their own life. It can apply to everyone, I guess, is what I'm saying, not just the theological self. Although I don't think he's necessarily not talking to the theological self, but I'm not sure he's adding much difference, much of anything for the theological self. I hope that he is, and I hope that I'm wrong. But that's kind of my theory. Maybe that will be a question for Dr. Amber Bowen. Does he add? I will ask her what she thinks of that. Okay, so I think that this is maybe, I'm not sure this is a good place to stop, but but we're returning to, but no, Abraham didn't succumb to these sort of questions or doubts or justifications or protestations. All right, so I think I'm going to make a little note because we're almost at the top of the hour of this is where we will return. If you're following along, I'm on page 17, and we have about 4-ish more pages. And then we get into the section that's entitled Problems. Sorry, I think my mouth wanted to say promises. Problems, a preliminary outpouring from the heart, which should be interesting. And I'm just really eager to get into the sections where he's talking about like the night of faith and I don't remember what the ascetic person, I can't remember. Is there a night of, there's a night of infinite resignation, because I've forgotten all that, and I think that's important. So I'm excited, but we're going to go through it as, it's not actually that long, so I don't know. We'll see. So for me, for you all, this will come out like after our Twitter spaces. But for myself, it is September 18th, and we have our Twitter spaces on the 24th. So I'll see if I can, read through this with you all a little bit each day and see how our thinking evolves. But if you have any sort of corrections or solutions or answers to any of my confusions, or if you think that any of my readings are kind of on the right track, let me know in the comments. And like I said, I haven't read any commentary on this book, and I'm going to wait until I go through my second read before I do that. All right, thank you all. I will catch you next week.